Welcome to another live stream. This is becoming one of my favorite ways to communicate with all of you. I like the live chat, the ability to communicate with you in real time. So if you're jumping in here, say hello in the chat. Thank you very much for joining. Let's get a couple thumbs up there before we start talking about the collapsing financial system, because again, we've gotten to this point where it seems like every day you look at the news and there's some update on the ongoing collapse of the financial system. This massively over leveraged kind of house of cards financial system that we have. Peter Pan says hiya in the chat. Hi, Peter. Hello to you, sir. And Donald Lehman from Northern Indiana. Hello. All right, now that we've got a few people in, let's start getting into this. And if you are just hopping in, please do give it a big thumbs up. Get this information out into the algorithm. So the latest update today, we've got First Republic Bank, the now second largest bank to fail in U.S. history. They have overtaken SVB for that dubious distinction. Over the weekend, had the FDIC and the Fed and all these folks trying to do damage control here on First Republic Bank, and they're looking for a buyer. And they've found one, JP Morgan. Apparently, JP Morgan's going to take on FRC, First Republic Bank, buy up all their troubled assets, take on all their deposits. However, this is nothing more than a bailout in disguise, if you ask me. Now, you won't hear it called a bailout in the mainstream media because that seems to have become a dirty word these days. You know, you'll never hear them acknowledge that these banks are getting bailed out. It's always some form of assistance or a buyout or, you know, an ostensibly a free market solution. But listen, this is not a free market solution. JP Morgan is receiving significant assistance in this purchase. So really what this is cronyism. It's favoritism towards this too big to fail bank, you know, and of course in a free market, there's no such thing as an entity that is too big to fail because, you know, if a big organization is inefficient and it's not something that can survive in a free market, then probably it's losing more resources than an inefficient small organization would be, right? So you wouldn't want any such thing as a too big to fail organization in a free market. And this isn't a free market. We have got the FDIC taking on about $13 billion worth of the losses associated with First Republic Bank here as part of this deal for JP Morgan to pick up the tab or to purchase this troubled bank. You know, the regulators, the powers that be in the financial system, they will pretty much do anything, it seems like, to avoid having to call this a bailout. But a hybrid free market solution, if you want to call that, where you have part state involvement, part market participant solution, it's just another bailout. That's all it is. In addition to the $13 billion that the FDIC is going to be taking on as part of this deal, JP Morgan is also going to get $50 billion worth of financing, some assistance, some additional assistance. So this is really just cronyism. And it's an important distinction because, you know, bailouts are not a good indication for the financial system. And that's the reason that they don't want to use that word, because when you start hearing the term bailout thrown around, it undermines confidence in the system and it threatens to create a cascading failure within the banking system. I mean, the whole reason that First Republic is in trouble in the first place is because two reasons, really. One is that depositors withdrew about $100 billion worth of deposits in the first 3 months of 2023 in Q1. And the other thing is that they had to sell assets to make up for that loss of deposits, and their assets are underwater. So they're having to take a huge loss, just like SVB. And you know, the reason that silver, I called this video a bailout insurance, silver is bailout insurance, is because ultimately there's really only two potential outcomes when you have a financial system and a banking system levered up the way that we have ours. And that is that you can either have the banks that are sitting on all of these bad assets, these treasuries that have this very low yield, that are worth significantly below their face value. These assets that they're being forced to sell, just like what happened to SVB, it now happened to FRC, First Republic Bank. You can have them have their depositors withdraw the funds, and then they sell these assets for a loss, and then they go under. And that's what we saw happen with First Republic here. Or You can have an organization like the Federal Reserve come in and they can take those assets, say, as collateral through the Bank Term Funding Program and put a bunch of liquidity into the banks, or you can have a too big to fail one of these gigantic banks like JP Morgan come in and with government assistance buy up all the assets. But where is the FDIC getting that $13 billion that they're going to eat? Where are they getting the $50 billion that they're going to loan to JP Morgan to make this deal work? Well, they don't have the money. I mean, ostensibly the FDIC is funded, I think, through premiums paid by banks. Banks are required to pay small premiums. They have some amount of funding, but they don't have the $1.7 trillion that would be needed to recapitalize the U.S. banking system. And I'm not pulling that number, out of the air. That's the number that Fortune told us the banks were sitting on, $1.7 trillion in unrealized losses. And, probably the issue likely goes much deeper than that. When you look at the derivatives markets in the global financial system, you're talking about quadrillions of dollars. Nobody really knows how deep this rabbit hole goes. There's not a tremendous amount of transparency in some of these markets, and so the 1.7 trillion in losses on these assets, like these low-yielding treasuries, I think is probably just scratching the surface. And when confidence ultimately is lost, because it's doomed to have confidence lost in a system like this. Eventually, the cracks will be too big. No amount of damage control will make them look good to investors and depositors. Eventually, people are going to get spooked and pull their money out, like we're already seeing happen. And as you see more and more cascading bank failures, which we're in kind of like a slow snowball effect now at this point, more and more depositors are going to be uncertain, and they're going to begin pulling their money out. So, really, silver is insurance in two ways. One, in the sense that it is money outside of the financial system, this over-leveraged financial system. So you don't have to worry about a bank run when you actually have custody of your physical wealth yourself. And also, if the Fed and the Treasury decide to just bail all these institutions out, which is probably the path they're going to go down, yeah, depositors will get their money, but unfortunately, that currency that they have, their deposits, is not going to buy very much because the purchasing power is going to be eroded by the inevitable inflation of all of that debt monetization. There's going to be a significant currency debasement if we continue down this road of bailouts, and I suspect that we will. Because again, this is really just a bailout disguised as a buyout. Now, we're going to go on to some other topics. I do want to just check the chat here, see if anybody's posting any questions or anything. If you guys have any questions or comments, anything you want me to cover, let me know. I have a few things lined up for this video, but I'm happy to go off on tangents. I see Yankee Stacking is there in the chat. Hello, Yankee. Welcome, sir. Now, to me, this deal is, it's not the first bailout that we're seeing disguised as a buyout. This was a lot like what happened with Credit Suisse, where we had UBS purchasing Credit Suisse, but I don't know if it was the ECB or the Swiss Central Bank. I know one of these big financial organizations had to come in and significantly sweeten the pot for UBS to pick this stuff up. So this is the new trend. Don't call it a bailout, call it a buyout through some gigantic, too big to fail organization, and then have the taxpayer and the government surreptitiously foot the bill by making these, complex agreements that your average person is just never going to take the time to look at. And it's kind of done in plain sight. It's an obfuscation of what's really going on, which is that all of these banks are indeed getting bailouts. And they're just getting started with this. This cascading bank failure could get much, much worse. And we're going to talk about one of the major catalysts that could kick that off here in just a moment. Now, it was interesting. This morning, we actually saw a pretty good rally in both gold and silver. At some point early in the day, silver was up about 3%, a little over 3%. It was over $26. Gold was also in the green. I think it was up to about $2,015. It's kind of been flirting around this $2,000 level, but then it got a nice smackdown right after that. Now, the smackdown, I want to talk about what caused that too, because it's an indication of how irrational these markets remain as we go through this financial collapse. But I will say that, I am still somewhat wary of both gold and silver, the paper price at this point. I talked about a potential pullback in the price of gold and silver in a live stream I did last week. And the kind of smackdown that we saw this morning, I think, was evidence that conditions are still ripe for that. And the reason for that is just that the US dollar index, the measure of strength of the US dollar versus foreign currencies, is still very oversold, and it did rally a bit today up to about 102. I'm not saying it's going to get back up to the highs that it was at last year when we saw kind of a bottoming in the metals where the US dollar index was around 114, but it is due for kind of a counter trend rally here. And same thing with the precious metals. Over the past 6 months, both of the metals are up quite a bit. And so I just think there's a little bit of room for some softness for a pullback here. Now, if banks keep failing and we keep getting these bailouts at an increasing pace, maybe that won't manifest itself, but it is something to be wary of here. And I think that it's something we need to watch out for a pullback until we get a solid close above certain technical levels. I think gold needs a close above $2,100, a new nominal all-time high, and silver probably over 28 bucks. And until that happens, I think we're going to be treading water a bit. But that doesn't mean that it's not a good time to be stacking. A Yankee says he bought another gold buffalo on the dip. But I think this summer is going to be bad for metals before a fall rally. Yeah, exactly. Okay, yeah, we're kind of on the same page there, Yankee. I would tend to agree. And I think it's just, a bull market correction for the metals because, again, they've gotten very elevated over the past 6 months. And the dollar index, I mean, the dollar index, you got to remember, over the past 8 months has dropped from 114 to 102. And then we're talking about the world's reserve currency. This is an enormous Forex market. So for it to move that much is, very significant. And it's just likely that we're going to see a bit of a rally here. And one of the reasons is you got all these countries around the world that have all this dollar denominated debt. The Fed is still cranking up rates. We're going to hear from the FOMC this week. And as those rates remain elevated, even though historically they're low, it's more expensive for these countries, these entities around the world with US dollar denominated debt to service that debt. They have to pay more interest. And so they got to spend their currencies, buy dollars to pay those debt service payments. And that puts some strength under the US dollar. That's actually what we saw last year as one of the main catalysts for the decline in precious metals that we saw and the boosting of the US dollar index. And I think that that is still in effect until the Fed pivots for real. We already know they've kind of done this stealth pivot rather, where they have begun expanding their balance sheet via the BTFP program. But, when the real pivot comes, don't worry, you'll know because the metals are going to likely be spiking up. Now, if you are interested in stacking some precious metals, make sure you check out sdbullion.com, channel sponsor. There's a link down in the description. Right now, they have some nice sales going on silver Britannias and gold Britannias. Now, I picked up some maple leaves maybe a month ago. I don't remember the exact time. I did an unboxing video for these. Maybe you guys remember. But I'm so happy that I bought these. I think when I got these, the premium on them was maybe $2.99 over spot or $3.99 over spot. It was a sale SD Bullion was having. And now the premiums on silver maple leaves, if you look, have gone up to about $6 or $7, regardless of where you're buying them. So I'm very happy I picked those up. And now SD Bullion has the gold maples, or I'm sorry, the gold Britannias. I think they have them for like 59 or 69 bucks over spot, any quantity, which is nice. I did a video for new stackers. That's the kind of deal you want to look out for, where you can buy one coin or 10 coins and get the same pricing if you're making small purchases. And that's typically what I do. And then the silver Britannias, same thing. They've got any quantity pricing on those, $3.99 over spot. So I have a suspicion that, a couple months from now, if we do see a big move into the physical precious metals, which is very possible, the premiums on those Britannias might end up being like the premiums on these maple leaves now. And, if we do see a pullback, say we see one this week or in the relatively near future, those Britannias are probably what I'm going to be looking at stacking if they're still available at this type of valuation. I think they're one of the best deals out there. It's a sovereign coin. It's nice to get sovereign coins versus generic rounds if they're going for about the same. And with premiums the way they are, $3.99 over spot for any quantity on a silver Britannia, really nice deal, I think. Anyway, that's what I'm going to be looking at. And I am certainly glad to have picked up these maple leaves when I did. This is my bailout insurance, remember? And it provides you some insurance against other type of events, which you're going to get to in just a moment. When I talk about that catalyst for a big spike up, some stuff that's in the geopolitical news at the moment. First of all, I do want to talk about what caused the pullback, though, today, the smackdown. Sometimes it's kind of hard to tell exactly what triggers some of this market movement, but the drop in gold and silver today seemed to be attributed to the release of the ISM Manufacturing Index. So that is the Institute for Supply Management. They released their numbers for April. Now, the number was better than expected. They expected this thing to print at 46.8. Last month's was 46.3. what the print was 47.1. So it's better than last month, better than expectations. But these indexes, the way that they work is any number under 50% represents a contraction in activity. So all that's happening now is manufacturing in the US is still shrinking. It's just shrinking at a slower pace. But still, markets interpreted this as, I suppose, good economic news. When you get a report like that, it's kind of hard to say. Is that good news or bad news, right? The economy is shrinking, but it's shrinking slower than we thought. So I guess that they interpreted that as good, though, because we saw the precious metals fall. And we still live in this bizarre market dynamic where we have high inflation and the economy is shrinking, and that somehow is bad for the metals when we get this news. And the reason is because investors are thinking, well, the Fed can remain elevated with rates for longer because the economy is not doing as bad as we expected and inflation is high. But they're missing the key point here that the Fed is not succeeding at controlling inflation. And I think there's going to be a watershed moment here. I don't know what's going to trigger it, some kind of a major event. Maybe it'll just be investors coming to their senses when they realize that inflation is not going back down to 2% anytime in the near future, unless, I don't know, maybe they completely reformulate the CPI just to make the inflation that we have now look like 2%. I mean, that's always possible, but prices in reality, in the real world, are not going to be falling. And when that realization comes for the market, I think that is when, whoops, dropping stuff here. High inflation data is going to begin buoying the price of precious metals rather than, bringing it down. And when poor economic data, which, what investors really should be focusing on here is that as the economy continues to collapse, it's going to mean more bailouts and more money printing. The price of precious metals should be reacting positively to this news. But if you ask me, the market's irrational behavior is the stacker's opportunity. And I, for one, am extremely glad that investors are getting this wrong because it means I can get my hands on physical metal at a lower price. And so, metals are going to do what they're going to do until the day comes that we see a currency crisis or a, black swan type event. This is my forecast, but the thing is that the situation is ripe for one of those. Yankee says they spend like drunken sailors. Who was it? Ronald Reagan said that that wasn't giving enough credit to the drunken sailors, and I will agree with that sentiment because at least the sailors, they're spending their own money. The government doesn't have any money; it just has what it takes from taxpayers. Now, let's see. What else did I want to cover today? What do you guys think about the live stream format? I think it's kind of enjoyable. It's a little bit more long form. I've had a few comments to the effect that it's too long, it's a little rambly, and I guess that is the case, but there's something about live stream where you can kind of get some thoughts out there, some ideas that you just might not get in a rehearsed format or an edited format. And also it's really enjoyable to be able to communicate with people watching in real time via the chat feature. I think that's very cool. THS says, love your channel. Thank you, sir. Donald Lehman says, what is a black swan event? Okay, a black swan event, if you're really interested, pick up Nassim Taleb's book, The Black Swan. It is absolutely worth a read. To give you a quick synopsis, it's an event that is catastrophic, and it could be in any domain, really, but the primary thing here is that it's something that you can't really foresee occurring. And so, you can predict something like, say, a pandemic. Well, then by definition, a pandemic is not a black swan event. Or essentially, it is just a risk event that can occur that those who are looking at the markets cannot anticipate ahead of times, and that it's hard to forecast the probability of. Like, it might be something that only happens once in a blue moon, but then when it does happen, it has a disproportionate effect. And so you can look back at various times when there have been market crises. For example, credit default swaps blowing up in the 2008 financial crisis. Nobody really saw that coming because a lot of people didn't understand how those instruments worked. And so you could call that potentially a black swan, although it's kind of hard to say because, a few people did see that coming. And, if you watch the movie or read the book, The Big Short, you can kind of see that the writing was on the wall there. But you might look at the blow up of CDS, things like that as black swan. But anyway, that's what a black swan is. And another I don't know if it's a black swan or not, but something that could be coming here in the near future. The reason I say it might not be a black swan is because this is something you could potentially see coming, like, plain as day. And that is the risk that we could see a significant escalation in Ukraine. This is something I saw recently in the news that NATO is now installing radiation sensors all throughout Ukraine to, I guess, potentially assess the effect of a dirty bomb or a tactical nuclear explosion there. Now, this is something that I mentioned in last week's live stream that the UK had delivered depleted uranium ammunition to the Ukrainian forces, and they were not doing a very good job of tracking it, according to the reports I read. And Russia says that they view the use of this type of munition as the equivalent of a dirty bomb. Now, that might sound like a minor escalation, but to me, if the Russians are saying, well, we're going to call this a dirty bomb, and there's some logic behind that. These things do leave behind radiological waste when they're used, and there's some historical evidence of that in Iraq and Yugoslavia. There have been some significant problems. But if this is a red line for Russia, this could mean that they will unleash a tactical nuclear weapon. And there's some significant speculation that this may be the case in response to the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which is kind of kicking off right now. Now, why am I talking about this? I mean, this is kind of a big diversion from the U.S. Financial system, but two reasons. One is that we know that the global financial system and the U.S. financial system clearly is very fragile at the moment. I mean, it's the opposite of a robust or anti-fragile system. There's tremendous amounts of leverage. There is a need for constant bolstering of confidence, because if participants in the system lose their confidence, the whole thing could fall apart. It all depends on confidence. And if we're on the verge of a potential nuclear exchange, now a lot of people, when I discuss this topic, will say, well, if that happens, the whole world's going to end. But that's not necessarily the case. You could see one tactical nuclear weapon go off in Ukraine from either side, but there seems to be a fairly significant risk of this taking place as this conflict escalates from the Russians. The battlefield significance of that event will absolutely pale in comparison to the financial fallout. So this is something that we need to be paying attention here. I mean, I think that you start talking about nuclear war and a lot of normalcy bias comes into this, where people think, this could never happen. We could never have a nuclear exchange. And the main reason that people believe this is because, there's never been one in our lifetimes, unless, you lived through World War II. And of course, there's only one country on the planet that has ever used nuclear weapons in warfare, but it has happened before and it could happen again. And it's starting to look like that may well be the case. And the probability of a global destructive strategic nuclear war, I think, is fairly low. Hopefully cooler heads will prevail there. But can you just imagine the panic if there's a major escalation over there and a tactical nuclear weapon goes off? I mean, remember the buying panics that we saw in 2020? That's going to look, minor by comparison. And as far as the financial system, in panic behavior, people might rush to get their assets out of banks. Investors will likely flock to the precious metals. I mean, if we do see that, and I'm not hoping for that by any means, I would rather the price of precious metals remain low and the economy not collapse and there not be a nuclear war and all this stuff. But these are becoming very probable events. Now, I would still rank them low in terms of, is this going to happen today? But when you keep playing this game of brinksmanship, day after day, month after month, year after year, like we seem to be, the risk for a miscalculation becomes very high. Have any of you ever read the book Alas, Babylon? It's a pretty good book from back in the 1950s. I believe the author's nom de plume is Pat Frank. I don't think that was his real name. But it's a very interesting book, and it has one of the best examples of how brinksmanship can lead to an escalation. There's a whole scene where, now mind you, this takes place in the 1950s, where some Soviet aircraft and U.S. aircraft are engaging in this kind of harassment behavior, I believe off the coast of Syria, and a young pilot who gets overexuberant from the U.S. side fires a heat-seeking missile at a Russian aircraft, and it diverts its guidance system, targets a dock in Syria, and this is all fictional, but it blows up a civilian or military facility, and that triggers the global world war. And I thought that in literature, at least as far as what I've read, has been one of the best things I've ever seen about how a game of brinksmanship in these two nuclear armed countries constantly one upping each other, engaging in these unsafe behaviors. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. I've read that in Syria, Russian pilots are dogfighting or trying to engage in dogfighting with U.S. pilots. If you Google Russia, U.S., Syria dogfighting, you'll find the story. But there's just been a lot of brinksmanship, and it doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. The U.S. now is sailing ships through the Strait of Taiwan and through the South China Sea, areas that China claims. The world is just a powder keg right now, unfortunately. And gold and silver represent insurance against all of these types of systemic risk, which sort of seem to have kind of an exponential effect on one another because domestically, you've got a real house of cards economy. We're coming up on the 40, or rather the 80 years after World War II, the end of World War II in 1945. We're coming up on the 80-year anniversary. And according to the fourth turning theory, generational theory, every 80 years or so, you see one of these major global conflicts and shifts in power around the world. And so, we're just approaching that point. And I don't know about you, but it's not financial advice. Of course, everybody's situation is different. Everybody, has their own way to manage their finances, protect themselves from risk. But for me, precious metals are a keystone of that. And, talking about panic buying and stuff like that, if we see a conflict escalate over in Ukraine, you want to make sure you're stocking up on the other essentials. You don't want to be one of these folks who waits until you see some news like, oh, a tactical nuclear weapon just went off in Ukraine, and then you rush out to the grocery store to get bottled water and canned food. Because when that announcement comes, you need to have everything in place. You need to be ready to hunker down, get the popcorn ready, bust out the battery powered hand cranked radio and listen, because you're not going to want to be participating in that kind of madness because it's not going to be safe. Yeah, you can't eat gold and silver, stacking surfaces. Make sure you have food storage and water. Absolutely. Very critical. And food and water are very important, but for most folks, there's only so much of that stuff you can store. So if you do have some extra assets, you want to get some wealth outside of the financial system, excuse me, gold and silver is an excellent way to do that. And it really is the ultimate insurance against government tomfoolery like bailouts and these buyouts disguised as bailouts, and also for this ongoing fifth generational warfare that we are experiencing. If there's a cyber attack, if there's nuclear warfare, if there's sanctions, gold and silver are going to be the thing to have. And you don't want to have SLV, you don't want to have a futures contract, you want to have this stuff, because the premiums on precious metals, I think the real physical tangible ones, in the event of that kind of panic, will absolutely blow up. And it's going to be the kind of panic, if this plays out this way. I mean, maybe everything will keep going along normal. I don't know. I hope that that's the case, but something just tells me, as we see year by year, things just seem to get crazier and crazier. I mean, starting in 2020, we have just had escalation and after escalation and risk after risk. We've got global conflicts, the potential for more breaking out. The U.S. banking system is falling apart. Inflation is running out of control. There's so many reasons to be stacking gold and silver right now. It's getting hard to list them. But I do just want to say a big thank you to everybody out there who tunes into these live streams. I'm really enjoying this format. Thank you all so much for watching. Stay safe and happy stacking, everybody. I'll catch you next time. Smart Silver Stacker, out.